The Senate Hall of Velcara Prime was loud that morning. It was always loud. That was the nature of the galactic conclave. Dozens of species, each one convinced that their problems were the most important problems in the known universe, all talking at the same time in different languages with different mouth parts at different volumes. The translation systems built into the ceiling hummed, constantly trying to keep up with the noise. Delegate S.C. Wrath of the Cath sat in his high-backed chair and listened to all of it with the patience of a very old and very tired reptile. His scales were a deep gray-green, faded. With age, his eyes were half-closed. He had been attending these Senate sessions for 60 years. In those 60 years he had heard arguments about trade routes, border disputes, water rights on dead moons, and at least 3 very passionate debates about the correct way to address a visiting diplomat from the all-collective. Today's argument was about a stretch of empty space near the galactic rim called the Drevathi Corridor. 2 species both claimed it. Neither species actually lived there. Both species simply did not want the other species to have it. S.C. Wrath had seen this exact argument 17 times in his career. He already knew how it would end. He was about to close his eyes entirely when the lights in the Senate Hall changed color. The walls shifted from their normal soft gold to a deep pulsing red. Every screen in the chamber flickered. The translation systems went quiet. The arguing stopped, which in S.C. Wrath's experience never happened naturally. Something had cut the signal. A voice came from the central speaker system. It belonged to the conclave's monitoring network, an automated system that only activated for events classified as Priority 0. In 60 years, S.C. Wrath had never heard it speak. Priority 0 signal received from deep range sensor array, galactic rim sector 9. Unknown object detected. Classification unresolvable. All Senate proceedings suspended pending review. The hall was silent for 3 full seconds, then it erupted in a much smaller and much quieter room 3 levels below the Senate floor. A young science officer named Murya was already reading the sensor report. Murya was a species known for their calm thinking and their ability to glow faintly blue when they were excited or frightened. Right now she was glowing quite brightly. She read the numbers twice, then a 3rd time because the numbers did not make sense. The object in question was approximately 3 km in length. Its mass was consistent with a large constructed vessel. It was moving at a steady sublight speed in a straight line heading inward along the galactic rim. But here was the part that made Murya glow brighter with every read. It had no engine output, no power signature, no heat, no radiation, no signal of any kind. It was simply moving as if it had been given a push a very long time ago and had been drifting ever since. The sensor array had first dismissed it as a large rock, then a second sensor pass had found the shape too regular, too deliberate for natural formation. 3rd pass had found traces of refined metal alloys in its surface composition, alloys that did not match any known species construction materials in the conclave database, which meant it was either a completely unknown species or it was something very, very old. Muriel was selected to lead the intercept team. She was given a small escort of 3 conclave vessels and told to proceed to the objects Location, observe, record, and report. Under no circumstances was she to attempt boarding without authorization. She accepted the mission, gathered her team, and boarded her ship. As they traveled toward the galactic rim, Muriel did what she always did when she encountered something she didn't understand. She went to the library. The Conclave's historical archive was not a small collection. It contained records going back 40,000 years gathered from dozens of species covering every major event in known galactic history. Most of it was dry political documentation, trade agreements, population counts, territorial maps that were now centuries out of date, but buried deep in the oldest sections, in files that had not been accessed in thousands of years. Muriel found something: humanity. The files were incomplete. Many were damaged, corrupted by age, or simply never properly preserved, but what remained was enough to build a picture. Humanity was a species that had emerged from a single planet, a world they called Earth, somewhere in what was now called the far interior, a region of the galaxy that had been largely uninhabited. For recorded history, they had developed space flight late. Compared to most conclave species, they were biological in structure, bilaterally symmetrical, warm-blooded, relatively fragile by the standards of species like the Cath. And yet, every military record that mentioned them used the same words: relentless, unpredictable, dangerous, not dangerous, in the way a Dravathi warrior was dangerous, a species bred for physical combat, armored by nature, built to fight. Humanity was dangerous in a different way. They were creative. They adapted quickly. They made tools and weapons that no one had seen before, and they did not retreat the way other species retreated. Most species, when a battle went badly, fell back to preserve their forces. It was logical. Resources were finite. Lives were valuable. Pulling back was simply good strategy. Humans, according to the records Muriel was reading, often did the opposite. When a battle went badly, they pushed harder. When they were outnumbered, they looked for ways to use that against the enemy. When they were losing, something in them seemed to activate a kind of furious, burning refusal that made them more dangerous, not less. One file from a Keth military officer who had observed humanity fighting during the early days of what the records called the Unraveling War. Read simply: I have studied combat for 40 years. I have never seen a species that treats near death as a reason to accelerate their attack. They do not fight like they expect to survive. They fight like they expect to win, and survival is secondary. Do not engage a human who has nothing left to lose. You will not survive the engagement. Then 30,000 years ago, every human signal had stopped, not gradually, not in stages, all at once. Every ship, every station, every colony on every planet they had settled gone. No wreckage, no distress calls, no explanation, as if an entire species had simply decided to stop existing. The galaxy had looked for answers for a few hundred years, then it had moved on. New empires had risen, old ones had fallen. The conclave had grown and changed and expanded, and humanity had faded from history into legend, from legend into myth, and from myth into a few damaged files in an archive that nobody read anymore. Muriel put her data pad down and stared at the viewport. Outside, the stars were very still and very quiet. They reached the object after 4 days of travel. Maria stood at the main viewport of her ship and looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was enormous, 3 km of dark metal, hanging in space with a kind of terrible patience, like something that had been waiting a very long time and was not in any hurry. Its hull was scarred and pitted by thousands of years of cosmic radiation, tiny impacts, particle streams, the slow erosion of deep space. But the shape beneath all that damage was still clear, still unmistakably deliberate. It was a warship. The design was nothing like anything in the Conclave's records, no visible engine nacelles in the configuration that modern ships used, no standard docking ports, the weapon systems, and there were weapon systems, large ones, visible even through the damage, were built into the hull itself rather than mounted externally. Whoever had designed this ship had built it to survive punishment. The hull plating was layered and reinforced in ways that modern engineering still would have had difficulty matching. Maria's crew moved quietly around her, running scans, recording everything, speaking in low voices the way people sometimes did when they were in the presence of something they didn't fully understand and weren't entirely sure they should be disturbing. Then one of her officers said, "Commander, look at the bow." Maria looked. There was writing on the hull, not scratched in, carved in deeply, clearly intentional, large enough to be read from a distance. The same text repeated in dozens of different scripts, as if whoever had put it there had wanted to make absolutely certain that any intelligent species in the galaxy could read it. Maria's translation system processed it in seconds. USV Prometheus, Earth Defense Fleet. We will return. Maria read it 3 times. Her crew had gone completely silent. Only sound was the quiet hum of the ship systems and the soft, distant thrum of the Prometheus drifting through the dark. Then, in the deep interior of the ancient warship, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the sensor readings, a faint increase in heat output from within the hull, then a flicker of power, small and brief, deep in the ship's core, then another and another. Then, in the center of the Prometheus's hull, a single porthole, sealed in dark for 30,000 years, lit up from the inside. One small rectangle of pale amber light, burning in the darkness of space. Maria stared at it. Her science officer spoke first. His voice was not quite steady. "Commander, something in that ship just woke up." Maria did not answer immediately. She was still looking at the light. One small window on a 3 km warship that had been drifting silently through the galaxy for 30,000 years. One light turning on in the dark, like a single eye opening after a very long sleep. She thought about the files she had read about the species that had carved those words into the hull before disappearing without a trace, about the ancient Keth officer's warning about 30,000 years of silence and what it might mean that the silence had just ended. She pressed the communication button on her console. "Conclave Command, this is Science Officer Muria Olm. I am transmitting current sensor data. We have located the object." She paused. "It is not a rock. It is not debris." Another pause. "Send more ships." She released the button and kept looking at the light. Somewhere inside the ancient warship, something was moving. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Muria's team sent signals toward the Prometheus on every frequency they could. Generate standard conclave greetings. Mathematical sequences, simple light. Pulses, old formats, new formats. Formats pulled from historical records. Nothing came back, the single amber light in the porthole continued to burn quietly, and the faint warmth inside the ship continued to build, but there was no response. Muria sat in her command chair and waited. She had ordered her crew to keep scanning and keep recording. She had ordered the escort vessels to hold position at a safe distance, and she had told everyone to stay calm, which she suspected was not entirely working, because several of her officers were glowing in colors that indicated high anxiety. She herself was maintaining a careful, even blue. Then in the 7th hour, the Prometheus spoke. It was not a visual signal, it was audio, a low-frequency broadcast that came from the warship's hull like a voice rising from deep water. The signal was heavily encoded, and Muria's AI system immediately began working on it. While it worked, the broadcast continued on a loop, the same sequence repeating, patient and steady as if whoever had sent it had all the time in the world. The decoding took 3 hours and 12 minutes. When it finished, the AI played the result through the bridge speakers. It was a human voice, female, clear and calm, with the careful, measured tone of someone who had practiced giving instructions in difficult situations. There was no fear in it, there was no uncertainty. It was the voice of someone who was used to being in charge and who expected to be listened to. Authentication protocol active. Identifying conclave frequency. Stand by. That was all. Muriel stared at the speaker as if she expected more. Nothing came. The broadcast had stopped. The ship was quiet again. Then her communication console lit up with a direct signal from the Prometheus, not broadcast, targeted, precise, aimed directly at her ship, as if the warship knew exactly where she was. A new voice, still human, still calm, but different from the first, slightly older, more formal, with an edge underneath it that reminded Muriel of the description she had read in the archives. Not threatening exactly, just very serious. Conclave vessel, this is Oracle, the operational intelligence of the UESV Prometheus Earth Defense Fleet. I have completed identification of your vessel class and communication frequency. I am aware that significant time has passed. I'm also aware that this may be unexpected. Please confirm that you are receiving this transmission. Muriel leaned forward and pressed the response key. This is Science Officer Muriel Ohm of the Galactic Conclave. We are receiving you. Oracle, can you tell us the status of your ship and crew? A brief pause, then the ship is functional. Primary systems are cycling from preservation mode. Weapons are offline as a courtesy. The crew is in cryogenic suspension. Revival protocols have been initiated. Estimated time to first revival 90 minutes. Another brief pause. You may approach for docking. I will extend a connection point. I must ask, however, that any boarding party be small and unarmed. Commander Vasquez will explain the reasoning when she is awake. Muria looked around at her crew. Several of them were glowing quite urgently. She understood why. Everything about this situation was outside any protocol she had ever trained for, but the voice from the Prometheus was calm. It had said the weapons were offline. It had invited them in. She made her decision. Prepare a boarding team, 4 people, no weapons. The docking connection extended from the Prometheus's hull like a slow arm. Reaching out in the dark, it connected to Muria's ship with a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the floor. The seal formed, the pressure equalized, and the inner door of the Prometheus opened. The boarding party consisted of Muria, 2 science officers, and a medical technician. They stepped through the connecting corridor and into the Prometheus. The interior was dark at first, then not. Dark lights activated above them as they walked, running ahead of them down the corridor like a guide, as if the ship itself was leading them somewhere. The air was cold and tasted strange. Old, filtered, preserved, but breathable. The walls were made of a dark metal that absorbed rather than reflected light, and the passages were built with a kind of functional austerity that Miria found unexpectedly striking. Nothing was decorated. Everything was built to work and to keep working and to keep working even after things went wrong. The engineering philosophy was visible in the construction itself. Oracle spoke from hidden speakers as they walked. The ship entered full preservation mode 30,000 years ago. The stasis field maintained hull integrity and internal systems at 0 decay state. I have been in a reduced operational mode, monitoring, calculating, waiting for the correct moment to resume full activity. The correct moment, by my calculations, was when conclave sensor technology became advanced enough to detect the ship at this distance. One of Miria's science officers murmured quietly, it was waiting for us to be able to find it. Correct, Oracle said pleasantly. It would have been inefficient to announce ourselves to a civilization not yet capable of doing anything useful. In response, they entered the cryogenic bay. It was the largest room Miria had ever seen inside a ship, rows upon rows of suspension pods, white and sealed, running the length of an enormous chamber that stretched ahead of them, farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Thousands of them. Each one held a human, visible through the transparent upper panel, still and frozen and preserved exactly as they had been the moment they were put under. Miria walked slowly between the rows. She looked at the faces, different features, different skin tones, different ages, all of them wearing the same dark armored suits, clearly military, all of them utterly still, and all of them, she realized with a quiet, strange feeling in her chest, had gone to sleep 30,000 years ago, not knowing if anyone would ever be there when they woke up. At the center of the chamber, one pod was different from the rest. It was cycling. The seal was releasing. Frost formed and dissolved on the surface as the temperature inside shifted. The panel turned from opaque to clear. The woman inside opened her eyes. Commander Ara Vasquez took her first breath in 30,000 years. It was not graceful. It never was coming. Out of deep cryo, the body needed a moment to remember how to do basic things. She coughed. She blinked several times. She pressed her palms flat against the inside of the pod and pushed herself upright with the slow, deliberate movements of someone reclaiming control of their own muscles, one at a time. Then she looked up and saw Maria. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maria was studying the human with the careful attention of a scientist trying to record everything at once. Ara was studying Maria with the sharp, steady attention of a soldier in an Unfamiliar situation, measuring, calculating, deciding. Ara's voice when it came was rough, from disuse but clear. What year is it? Maria told her. The number was so large that it took a moment to process. Ara's expression did not collapse, it did not break apart. But something moved behind her eyes. Shadow passing through, and she was quiet for several seconds. Maria waited, not entirely sure what to say. Did we win? Ara asked. Maria hesitated. The unraveling has not been detected for 30,000 years. The galaxy has been at peace. Ara was quiet again, then she nodded. Once good, she swung her legs over the side of the pod and stood up. Her legs held, she stood straight and the shadow behind her eyes was still there. But her voice was steady when she spoke. Again, I need a full strategic briefing. Everything that's happened in the last 30,000 years, condensed to what I need to know. Can your ship handle that? Muriel blinked. That is a very large amount of information. Then start with the important parts. Ara looked around the cryogenic bay at the thousands of still pods. Her voice softened just slightly. And then we need to wake up my crew. Over the next several hours, the picture came together in pieces. Muriel sat with Ara in a small room off the main corridor and talked. Ara listened more than she spoke. She asked precise questions. She did not react with visible emotion to most of what she heard, but Muriel was beginning to understand that this did not mean she was not feeling it. Humanity's disappearance, Ara explained, had not been an accident or a defeat. It had been a choice. 30,000 years ago, the entity the conclave called the Unraveling had not simply attacked the galaxy's borders. It had been consuming them, moving inward, dissolving matter and energy and coherent space into a kind of formless nothing that nothing could survive. The conclave's forces had fought it. They had lost ground every day. The humans had proposed a different strategy. Rather than hold the line, follow it, chase the unraveling back to wherever it came from, find the source, seal it. We went through the rift, Ara said. The whole fleet, every human ship in service. A pause. The Prometheus was the last ship through the rift. Collapse caught us, damaged our drive. We couldn't go forward, and we couldn't come back. Oracle initiated the preservation field to keep the crew alive. We've been drifting since the rift closed. Maria was quiet for a moment, and the rest of the fleet. Ara looked at the wall. They sealed the rift from the inside. The silence that followed was very complete. It was Oracle who broke it, speaking from the room speaker in its dry, precise voice. If it is relevant, I should mention that my long-range sensors are detecting dimensional instability patterns along the galactic rim, minor at present, but the pattern is consistent with early-stage unraveling activity. I calculate a 73% probability that this is not a coincidence. Ara turned her head slowly toward the speaker. Her voice was very even. How long? Unknown with precision, but I would suggest not taking too long with the briefings. Maria looked at Ara. Ara looked at the wall for one more second, then she stood up, and whatever had been in her eyes was gone, replaced by something cleaner and harder and completely focused. Wake my crew, she said, all of them, and get me a meeting with whoever runs this galaxy. The transport ship carrying Ara and her small team arrived at Velkara Prime 3. Days later, Ara had chosen 12 people to accompany. Sir, Sergeant Major Dauphin, her senior combat officer, a broad, quiet man who said very little and noticed everything, stood at her right shoulder the moment he was revived and had not moved far from it since. Dr. Keiko Mura, the ship's xenobiologist, had been the third person revived and had spent the entire 3-day journey glued to a data terminal reading 30,000 years of galactic history with the focused intensity of someone who had been given an impossible gift and refused to waste a second of it. The other 10 were core personnel. Engineers, pilots, medical officers, all experienced, all steady. Muriel had traveled with them and tried to prepare them for what was coming. She was not sure she had done a good enough job. Velkar Prime was beautiful in the way that old, powerful things are sometimes beautiful. Its cities rose in sweeping curves of pale stone and glass, built over centuries by dozens of different species, working alongside each other, each adding their own architectural style, until the whole planet looked like a conversation between 100 different civilizations. The sky was a deep amber. The air smelled of something. Keiko immediately began analyzing and taking notes about. But the city was not calm when the humans arrived. News traveled fast in the conclave, and the news of the Prometheus had traveled faster than usual. By the time Ara's transport touched down at the diplomatic port, there were crowds outside the barriers. Some were simply curious. This was the most remarkable thing to happen in the galaxy, in living memory, which for some species was a very long time. Others were more agitated. Some held signs. Muriel caught fragments of different arguments in the crowd. Is it safe? Can we trust them? What do they want? Who gave them permission to come here? Dao looked at the crowd through the viewport without expression. Then he looked at Muriel. How long until the Senate meeting? 2 hours, Muriel said. Good. He settled back in his seat. I'll sleep. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Muriel stared at him for a moment, then looked at Ara. Ara was watching the crowd outside. Her expression was steady, but her eyes were doing that thing Muriel had noticed over the past 3 days, moving constantly, taking in everything, cataloging details, the way a person did when they had spent their whole life in situations where noticing a small thing at the wrong moment could mean the difference between walking out and not walking out. They're afraid, Ara said quietly. Some of them, Muriel agreed. Good. Ara turned away from the viewport. Afraid means they're paying attention. I can work with people who are paying attention. The Senate Hall of Velkara Prime could hold 600 delegates for this session. There was not an empty seat. Every delegate who could reach the planet had come. Others attended via long-range communication screens that lined the upper walls, faces from dozens of worlds, watching in real time. The noise level when Ara's team entered was significant. It dropped as they walked in. Ara walked steadily without hurrying. Her 12 people arranged behind her in a loose formation that was not exactly military but carried the memory of it. Her armor the same dark suit she had been wearing when she was revived, cleaned and checked by the Prometheuses. Maintenance systems was still clearly foreign, clearly ancient, clearly not from any species in this room. Several delegates leaned forward to get a better Look, others leaned back. Cyrith watched from his seat with his half-closed eyes. He had attended a lot of historic events in 60 years of Senate service. He had learned to recognize them by the particular quality of silence that fell before they happened. This was that silence. Ara stood at the central speaking position. She looked around the chamber. She did not seem impressed or intimidated. She looked like someone who was doing a quick assessment of a room before deciding how to address it. She waited. The Senate moderator cleared his throat. Commander Vasquez of the vessel Prometheus, the Galactic Conclave thanks you for your attendance in recognition of humanity's historical contribution to Galactic. Thank you, Ara said, not unkindly but clearly. I've read the prepared welcome. I appreciate it. I'd like to skip to the part that matters. A pause. Where is the unraveling right now? The hall was quiet for a moment, then it was not. Several delegates spoke at once. The translation system scrambled to keep up. Cyrith watched still as the room processed the question and then began to do what Senate rooms always did: dissolve into competing voices. A Drevathi delegate rose. The Drevathi were tall, armored by nature with bone plates along their shoulders and foreheads. This one was looking at Ara with an expression that Muria, standing to the side of the chamber, could only describe as reverence. The unraveling has not been present in this galaxy for 30,000 years. Your people sealed it. We slowed it, Ara said. More silence. We sealed the rift, she continued, her voice steady and careful, making sure every word was clear. We collapsed the dimensional passage that the unraveling was using to enter this galaxy. We bought you time. But a sealed rift is not a permanent solution. The unraveling does not stop. It finds other ways. 30,000 years is a long time, but it is not forever. She looked around the chamber. Your own sensor data from the galactic rim supports this. I've been reviewing it. A Cath delegate stood sharply. That sensor data is unconfirmed. Minor anomalies. There is no established connection between some rim fluctuations and Oracle Aris said. The voice of the Prometheus's AI came through the chamber speakers. Every delegate went still. The AI had been patched into the Senate's communication system at Aris's request, and its voice, dry, precise, unhurried, filled the room with the same quality as something very large and very confident taking a breath. The dimensional fracture patterns currently developing along the galactic rim have a 91.4% structural similarity to the early state activity recorded by human deep space Array 7 in the years preceding the unraveling war. For reference, I am accessing your own unanalyzed sensor data from the last 40 years and overlaying it with our historical records. Please observe your screens. Every screen in the Senate Hall changed. Two sets of data appeared side by side. One was old, pulled from the Prometheus's archives, 30,000-year-old. Readings from humanity's early warning systems documenting the first signs of what had eventually become the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. The other was recent conclave data, gathered over the last 40 years by sensors that had flagged the readings as minor anomalies and filed them away. They were the same pattern. Not similar, not roughly comparable, they same. The hall was completely silent. Kekoa, standing near Muria at the side of the chamber, spoke very quietly. I Spent 3 days reading your history. Your science teams flagged those readings 4 times. The reports were submitted. The Senate committees reviewed them. She paused. They were all marked as low priority. Muriela closed her eyes briefly. She was aware that this was true. She had seen those reports herself in the background. Noise of conclave data management. They had not seemed significant. They had not seemed significant because the unraveling was ancient history, and ancient history did not come back. Except when it did. The Senate session lasted 6 hours. Ara spoke for less than 30 minutes of it. The rest was the conclave doing what it always did, arguing, negotiating, denying, counterproposing, requesting procedural reviews, and finding 17 different ways to say, we need more time to study this, without actually saying it. Ara sat through all of it with the stillness of someone who had made peace with the fact that this was how groups of people worked, and there was limited value in trying to change it. Dao slept again briefly in his chair, which caused visible consternation among several delegates sitting nearby. Kekoa took continuous notes. During a recess, Esarith found himself standing near Ara at the refreshment area at the side of the hall. He was not entirely sure what had brought him there. He had intended to speak with the Dravathi delegation. He had instead walked this way. He looked at Ara. She looked back at him with those steady, measuring eyes. You are not surprised, he said, by the Senate's reaction. No, she said. You expected the denial. I expected people to react the way people react when they are shown something they very much do not want to be true. She paused. We did the same thing on Earth before the war. There were warnings for years before anyone in authority took them seriously. When the unraveling finally reached our borders, we spent the first 3 months arguing about whether it was really happening. Isureth was quiet for a moment. What changed? Ara's expression was very even. It started destroying inhabited worlds. Isureth had nothing useful to say to that. He was about to speak again when every screen in the hall changed color. Not to the Senate standard alert red, to something different, a deep bruised orange that Miria, re-entering the hall at that moment, had never seen before. Color the system used for confirmed external events, real-time events. Oracle's voice came through the speakers. Again, not dry or unhurried this time. Precise and quick. I am receiving a distress signal from the Dravathi border system of Kelmora. The signal was sent 42 minutes ago at the speed of light. I have enhanced and decoded it, transmitting now. The screen showed a star system coming apart, not from a weapon, not from a natural disaster, from something that was dissolving it, unmaking it, consuming matter and space and coherent physics in a spreading wave that moved outward from a central point like ink dropping into water. Planets, stations, ships, all of it disappearing into a spreading gray. Nothing, perfectly silent, as if the universe was simply choosing to stop being in that place. The conclave Senate hall was the quietest Isureth had ever heard it. Dahl was fully awake now. He looked at the screens. He looked at Ara. He said, nothing. Ara looked at the screens for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the central speaking position. Again, the unraveling is back, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the room. The arguing is over. This is what we do now. The Emergency War Council Lasted 2 days. Conclave admirals argued over defensive formations, perimeter strategies, and supply lines. Species representatives argued over whose territory would be protected first. Scientific committees argued over whether the readings from the Kelmorian system were conclusive. Oracle patched into the conference room systems stopped contributing to the discussion after the 3rd hour and switched to what it described when asked as more productive work. Era sat through the first day without speaking much. She listened, she watched, she mapped the arguments in her head and sorted the people in the room into 2 categories: those who were arguing because they were afraid and trying to manage that fear through words, and those who were genuinely trying to solve a problem but didn't have the right framework yet. The second group was smaller, but it existed. On the morning of the 2nd day, the conclave's frontline reports started coming in from the galactic rim. 3 more border systems had gone dark. The speed of the unraveling's advance was faster than anyone had modeled. Combined conclave fleet of 80 ships had engaged an unraveling tendril near the system of Vorath 9 and had been, in the careful language of the military report, unable to prevent significant territorial loss. In plain language, they had lost badly. The tendril had not responded to conventional weapons the way the admirals expected. Their formation strategies had assumed an enemy that moved forward in a line like a conventional fleet. The unraveling did not move like a conventional fleet. It expanded outward in all directions from its contact points, dissolving space as it went, and a defensive formation that was strong from the front was simply outpaced from the sides. Ara read the report, then she walked to the front of the room and said, "Give me the task force." Conclave Admiral Vreth, a Cathar, old and decorated and visibly unhappy about all of this, looked at her with his sharp reptilian eyes. "You have one ship, Commander. One ancient ship with a crew of—" "I have the Prometheus," Ara said, "and I have 30,000 years of experience fighting exactly this enemy. Give me command of the task force. I'll teach your fleet how to fight it." The argument that followed lasted 6 hours. Vreth was not alone in his resistance. Most of the senior conclave officers found the idea of handing command authority to a human who had, from their perspective, appeared out of nowhere 4 days ago to be somewhere between deeply uncomfortable and outright unacceptable. Several of them said so at length. Several of them questioned the Prometheus's actual combat capability. One of them questioned whether humanity's ancient tactics were even relevant to modern combat conditions. Oracle, from its speaker, said, "If it is useful context, I have spent the past 48 hours analyzing every combat engagement in conclave military records for the past 3,000 years. Your standard tactical doctrine relies heavily on coordinated broadside fire patterns and defensive perimeter holding. Against a conventional enemy, it is adequate. Against the unraveling, which operates on volumetric expansion rather than linear advance, it is, with respect, approximately as useful as building a wall to stop water." Vreth's jaw tightened. He looked at the wall, then he looked at Ara, then slowly, with the expression of a very experienced officer making a decision he was not comfortable with, he said, "Emergency command authority for combat. Operations only. You report outcomes to me after every engagement. Agreed, Ara said. We move in 12 hours. The Dravathi corridor was a stretch of space between 3-star systems that the Conclave had been using as a trade and transit route for centuries. It was also, according to oracles, projections, the most likely next point of unraveling contact, a natural expansion path based on the entity's current movement pattern. Ara's task force assembled there, the Prometheus at the center, flanked by 40 Conclave ships of various classes, with an additional 20 in reserve. It was more firepower than any single engagement had deployed in the current crisis. Ara looked at the formation from the Prometheus's command deck and made several immediate changes that had Conclave officers across the fleet asking confused questions through the communication channels. She spread the formation out significantly where standard doctrine would have the fleet fly in tight, mutually supporting clusters. Ara arranged them in a wide, loose pattern that covered a much larger volume of space. Several Conclave captains noted that this made them less able to support each other in a conventional engagement. This is not a conventional engagement, Ara told them through the fleet-wide channel. The unraveling expands outward. If you cluster together, you are giving it a concentrated target spread out. Your job is not to defend each other. Our is to attack from multiple directions at once and force it to divide its expansion pressure across too many vectors. That is not standard doctrine, one captain said. No, Ara agreed, it is not. The unraveling tendril arrived 4 hours later. It appeared in the sensor feeds as a spreading gray distortion eating space at the near edge of the corridor, moving outward in all directions from its contact point. At normal approach, Ara calculated that the Conclave formation would have been flanked and overtaken within 40 minutes. Instead, the first wing of Conclave ships positioned far to the leading side of the distortion opened fire on a vector the unraveling had not yet expanded into, targeting the physical boundary of its expansion front. The goal was not to destroy what was already dissolved. The goal was to disrupt the expansion process at its edge, the way you stop a fire by cutting off its fuel at the border rather than fighting the flames already burning. It worked. Not completely, not easily. The tendril pushed back against the disruption, pushing harder in the directions it was not being attacked, but Ara had positioned ships for that, and when it shifted, she told the fleet to shift, with it staying on its boundary, keeping pressure on its edges, never letting it expand freely in any direction for more than 30 seconds at a time. The Prometheus moved through the battle like something that had been doing this for a long time because it had. Ara calculated firing solutions at speeds no human gunner could have matched, but Ara's crew carried out the physical execution with a kind of fluid efficiency that came from training and trust in the simple fact that they had all been through worse. The battle lasted 3 hours, the tendril unable to expand freely, unable to consume enough space to sustain it. Advance collapsed inward and went. Still, not destroyed, the unraveling could not be destroyed by weapons fire any more than you could destroy a flood by shooting water. But it was pushed back, its advance halted, its immediate expansion neutralized. When the battle ended, Muria's ship was positioned at the outer edge of the formation. She had watched the entire engagement. She had watched the Prometheus move through combat, patient, deliberate, terrifyingly effective. And she had watched the Conclave fleet, uncertain at first, gradually fall into the patterns Aura had set for them and start functioning with a coordination she had never seen in fleet exercises. Her science officer said quietly, "They do not fight the way we fight." "No," Murray said, "they don't." The second engagement was at Station Mayo. Mayo was a deep space research station near the galactic rim, inhabited by 3,000 Conclave scientists and support personnel. An unraveling tendril had anchored itself to the station's immediate area, not yet consuming it but pressing close, an expanding contact point that would reach the station within hours. Aura reviewed the station's blueprints. She looked at the unraveling's contact point on the sensor feeds. Then she said, "Dao." Dao looked up from where he was running equipment checks on the other side of the command deck. "Boarding operation," she said. "Tendril has an anchor point, a physical location where its expansion originates. If we collapse that point from the inside, the tendril loses its foundation." Dao finished, falls apart from the base. He thought about it for a moment, like pulling the root instead of cutting the branches. "Exactly." Dao nodded. "I'll need 6 people and enough demolition material to encourage a dimensional anchor point to stop existing." Muria, who had been aboard the Prometheus for the mission briefing, stared at both of them. "You are planning to board an active, unraveling contact point?" "Yes," Dao said. "On foot?" "On foot," he confirmed pleasantly, "with explosives." Muria looked at Aura. Aura looked back at her with the expression of someone who had watched Dao do this kind of thing before and had made peace with it. The operation took 90 minutes. Dao's team moved in via fast transport, entered the physical space immediately. Adjacent to the anchor point, a region of deeply wrong-feeling space where physical laws were beginning to blur at the edges, planted a significant quantity of shape charges around the anchor structure and left quickly. The detonation sequence was set for 60 seconds after their exit. The explosion, in dimensional terms, was small. In practical terms, it tore the root out from under the tendril's entire expansion framework. The tendril, severed from its anchor, actually unraveled, pulling inward, collapsing on itself, and disappeared from the sensor feeds like smoke and wind. Station Myra was safe. 3,000 people were alive who would not have been on the fleet channel. An older Conclave captain said very quietly, "They breached and bombed a dimensional anchor point from another ship." A Dravathi captain said in a tone of reverent awe that he did not seem aware he was using. Of course they did. The battles continued. They were not all clean victories. At the edge of the Kaith frontier, a tendril was larger than any previous one and pushed through the fleet's outer formation before it could be redirected, consuming a section of space that included 3 unmanned monitoring stations and the wreckage of an old transport ship. 2 Conclave vessels were caught in the expansion front and lost. Aura did not announce this to the fleet. She put it in the report to Vireth. She recorded the names of the crews. She moved on because that was what you did, and because stopping was not an option, and because she had made her peace with This kind of cost a very long time ago, which did not make it easier, only more familiar. That night she sat alone on the Prometheus's observation deck. The deck was a wide, transparent section of the hull that faced outward into open space. 30,000 years ago, it had been a common room where crew members came to eat and talk and look at the stars. Now it was quiet, lit only by the light of the galaxy outside. Ara sat in a chair that had been bolted to the floor for 30,000 years and looked at the stars. They were not the same stars she had grown up under. Earth was 30,000 light years and 30,000 years away. The people she had known before the war were gone so long ago that no record of them remained anywhere in the galaxy, except the Prometheus's crew files and her own memory. She thought about the fleet that had followed the unraveling into the rift. She thought about their commanding officers and their engineers and their medics. She thought about the decision they had all made together in a briefing room not unlike this one 30,000 ago. Follow it, seal the door, and trust that what they were protecting was worth the cost. She thought about 30,000 years of silence, 30,000 years of the galaxy not knowing, 30,000 years of human names not spoken, human faces not remembered, human sacrifice not honored. Commander, Miria's voice from the doorway. Ara did not turn. Come in. Miria sat down in the chair across from her. For a moment they were both quiet, looking at the stars. Why did you follow it into the rift? Miria asked. The unraveling. Why didn't you fight it here? You were strong. Your fleet was, even by what I have seen in the last week, extraordinary. You could have fought it from this side. Ara was quiet for a long moment. Because if we fought it here, she said, it would have destroyed everything behind us while we were fighting it in front. The unraveling doesn't engage and retreat. It expands in every direction at once. If we held our ground and fought it at the border, it would go around us, over us, through the inhabited systems we were protecting. So we chased it. We pulled it into the rift, away from everything it was trying to consume. We sealed the door behind us. A pause. We bought you time. That's what soldiers do. They stand between the people they love and the thing that wants to hurt them, even when those people will never know their names. Miria was quiet for a very long time. Then she said simply, we know your names now. Ara looked at her for just a moment. Something in those steady eyes softened. Then she nodded once and looked back at the stars. From the speaker above them, Oracle said with slightly more gentleness than it usually employed, I have also completed analysis of the unravelings. Overall advance pattern. I require the commander's attention when she is ready. A pause. Take your time. It was quiet for a while longer. The stars burned in the dark, cold and steady and very old. Oracle presented its analysis the following morning. Every senior officer of the task force was present. Conclave admirals Dravath, commanders, Keth fleet captains Muria, and Ara's own people. They stood around the central holographic display of the command deck, and Oracle showed them the complete picture for the first time. The tendrils they had been fighting were not the unraveling, they were its fingers reaching through the first fractures in the dimensional seal, testing the galaxy, expanding where they could, pulling back where they were pushed. The seal that humanity had created 30,000 years ago was not broken. It was Cracking, and behind those cracks, building pressure on the other side, was the full body of the entity, vast beyond easy description, moving with a slow, inevitable patience that suggested it had all the time that time could hold. Oracle displayed its projections in cold, clear numbers. At the current rate of seal degradation, the primary breach, a full opening of the dimensional barrier would occur within 4 to 9 years. When it did, the tendrils they had been fighting would become irrelevant. The full unraveling would pour through with the force of something that had been building pressure against a closed door for 30 millennia. Conclave simulations ran automatically in the corner of the display. They all showed the same outcome: total galactic extinction within 3 centuries of a primary breach. The room was very quiet when Oracle finished. Admiral Vreth spoke first, reinforcing, "The seal is not possible. Our technology does not approach what would be required to rebuild a dimensional barrier of that scale." A pause. "Defense of the breach point is also not viable. Even with all current conclave forces holding a breach of that size against the full unraveling, we're not going to defend it," Ara said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the display. Her expression was the same as it had been since the moment she had woken up in the cryopod, calm, focused, already somewhere ahead of the conversation she was currently having. Dahl was standing beside her, arms folded. He was also looking at the display with the expression of a man who suspected he already knew what was coming and was deciding how he felt about it. "Oracle," Ara said, "tell them about the fold sphere." The fold sphere was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It had been a project 30,000 years ago, an emergency project developed in the final years before the human fleet followed the unraveling into the rift. The physics behind it were complex enough that even Oracle took 10 minutes to explain it in terms the room could follow. The simple version was this: the fold sphere did not fire a projectile or a beam or an energy pulse. It folded space. It took a targeted volume of dimensional structure and collapsed it inward in on itself permanently. Not a temporary seal, not a patch, a complete permanent elimination of the dimensional passage. If it worked, the unraveling could not come through because there would be no through to come through. The dimensional breach would not be blocked. It would cease to exist. It was not finished when we followed the unraveling through the rift, Ara said. Oracle has been working on the remaining calculations for 30,000 years. She looked at the AI speaker, and there was something in her voice that Myra had not heard before, warm almost. "Oracle, the calculations are complete," Oracle said. "The fold sphere drive is functional. I completed it sometime in the 14th millennium. I have had nothing but time." Vreth leaned forward. "Then why not use it now at the current fracture points?" "The fractures are too small and too scattered," Oracle said. "The fold sphere requires a target of sufficient dimensional density. The fractures do not qualify. The primary breach, however, will. When the breach opens," Ara said, "we fly the Prometheus into it. Oracle fires the fold sphere from inside the breach. The dimensional passage collapses permanently from the inside." The room was quiet again. Dow, without moving, said, "One-way trip." "Yes," Ara said. "We go in, we fire. The passage closes behind us." "Yes." Dao looked at the display for a moment. Then he unfolded his arms, stretched his neck and said, "All right, what do you need me to pack?" Keiko, standing across the display from both of them, had gone very still. She was looking at Aura with the expression of someone who was doing several difficult emotional calculations simultaneously. Then she picked up her data terminal, quietly saved the 30,000 years of xenobiological research she had compiled over the past weeks to a transmittable file, and set it on the table. "When does the primary breach open?" "Oracle's projection is 9 days, Aura said. "Give or take 12 hours. The war council that followed was different from all the previous ones. When Aura laid out the plan, the Prometheus flying into the primary breach, firing the fold spear, permanently closing the dimensional passage, there was no argument about whether it was the right strategy. The Conclave's own analysts confirmed Oracle's projections. There was no other option that produced a survivable outcome. What there was instead was a silence that lasted for nearly a full minute. After Aura finished speaking, in which every person in the room sat with what they were being asked to accept. Then Miria stood up. "I want to propose an escort mission," she said. "The Prometheus will need time to reach the breach point after it opens. The Unraveling's vanguard fight to prevent anything from reaching it." She looked around the room. "I am requesting volunteers for a fleet that will clear the corridor to the breach point. We hold the path open long enough for the Prometheus to get through." Vreth said, "That corridor will be the most contested space in galactic history." "Yes," Miria said. "The losses will be significant." "Yes," she said again. Vreth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the display, then, slowly, with the weight of someone who had spent his whole life making hard decisions and had just reached the hardest one, he said, "The Keth fleet stands with you." The Dravathi commander stood without speaking. His people had built their culture around the myth of humanity. They had told stories for 30,000 years about the species that had walked into the dark so that the rest of the galaxy could live. He had nothing to say that. Added to that, he simply stood. One by one, the other fleet commanders. Miria looked at Aura. Aura looked back at her. She gave her a single nod. The primary breach opened on a clear, cold morning by the galactic clock, on the 9th day, almost exactly when Oracle predicted. It appeared in deep space at the edge of the galactic rim like a wound being torn open, a spreading darkness that was not the natural darkness of space, but something else entirely, something that the eye looked at and the mind refused to process correctly. It was large, larger than anything the Conclave forces assembled at the perimeter had been prepared for, even knowing that projections. 3 star systems worth of sky began to dim as the Unraveling's vanguard poured through the edges of the breach. The Conclave fleet was waiting. Miria's ship was at the front of the escort formation. Behind her, hundreds of vessels from dozens of species stretched back through space in a corridor aimed directly at the center of the breach. They were not there to stop the Unraveling. They knew they could not stop it. They were there to hold the corridor open, to bleed for every meter of it, to give the Prometheus a path. "All ships," Miria said over the fleet channel, "hold the corridor." The battle that followed was the largest engagement in 30,000 years of galactic history. The Unraveling's vanguard pushed against the corridor walls with the force of something that had been waiting a very long time to be free. Ships on the corridor's outer edges were consumed, the unraveling dissolving them with the same patient, terrible indifference with which it dissolved everything but the corridor held. The Dravathi ships threw themselves at every expansion front with a ferocity that bought seconds turned into minutes. The Caith fleet's precision fire disrupted anchor points before they could form. Species that had been arguing in the Senate Hall 2 weeks ago were now covering each other's flank without being asked, and down the center of the corridor, moving at full power for the first time in 30,000 years, the Prometheus burned. Ara stood at the helm. The command deck was active with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had been trained for this exact kind of moment. Not this specific moment, but the type. The moment when everything comes down to one thing and you do that one thing as well as it can possibly be done. Oracle ran targeting calculations. Without pause, the AI's voice narrated the approach in calm, factual intervals. Distance to breach, corridor integrity. Fold sphere charge status, estimated. Time. From the fleet channel, voices came and went. Ships calling their status, damage. Reports, formation adjustments, and underneath all of it, the Dravathi commander's ship broadcasting 30,000-year-old Dravathi war chant that Keiko, with tears she was not bothering to stop, translated in real time as a song about standing in the dark so that others could have the light. The Prometheus reached the edge of the breach. Oracle Ara said. Fold sphere charged, awaiting firing. Position, a pause, 15 seconds to optimal. Breach entry. Dow at the engineering station looked at Ara's back. He had known her since before the first unraveling war, since before the rift, since Earth, he thought about the briefing room where they had made the decision to follow the unraveling into the dark the first time. He thought about everyone who had gone through that rift and not come out. He thought we kept our word, we came back, that counts for something. 10 seconds, Oracle said. Keiko had both hands flat on her console, her eyes were closed. The Prometheus entered the breach. The dimensional passage was vast and wrong in every direction, space that was not space, dark that was not dark, depth that the ship sensors could not fully measure. The unraveling was everywhere around them, vast and ancient and indifferent. In the distance, if distance meant anything here, something vast moved. Optimal firing position, Oracle said. Firing in 3-2. Ara opened the fleet-wide communication channel. She had thought about what to say. She had spent 3 days thinking about it. In the end, she had decided to say the simplest thing, the thing that was true, the thing she needed the galaxy to know. Humanity kept its promise, she said. Tell the stars we were here. She nodded to Oracle. The fold sphere fired. Muria saw it from inside the corridor. The breach, that vast dark wound in the fabric of space, contracted, slowly at first like a hand closing, then faster. The unraveling's vanguard reacted, pouring back toward the breach, pulled inward by whatever force was collapsing. The dimensional passage from inside. Ship captains along the corridor shouted damage reports and then gradually went quiet as they realized the expansion. Fronts were pulling back, retreating. Not to regroup, to return to the only thing they could return to, the only place they could exist, as the passage they had come through ceased to exist. The breach closed. Not sealed. Sealed could be broken. It did not close the way a door closes. It closed the way a door ceases to be a door. The space where it had been was simply ordinary space again. Unremarkable, permanent, the dimensional passage that the unraveling needed to enter this galaxy was gone, not blocked, not locked, gone. The unraveling's vanguard cut off, unmade by its own nature, without a passage to sustain it, dissolved, not into nothing, into the ordinary fabric of space, harmless, the way a wave dissolves when it reaches the shore. The battle was over. The galaxy was quiet. Muriel sat in her command chair in the ringing silence that followed, and she did not speak, and several of her crew were crying, and she thought she probably was too, and she did not check, because it did not matter. 1 year later, a monument was unveiled on Vilcura Prime. It stood in the central plaza of the capital city, visible from a significant portion of the surrounding area. It was built from a dark alloy, the same material as the Prometheus's hull, salvaged from the fleet and donated by every species that had fought in the corridor battle. The form was simple, a 3 km long silhouette of the Prometheus, rendered to scale, rising at a slight upward angle as if still moving forward, still going somewhere. Muriel stood at the unveiling ceremony. Esarith stood beside her. He was very old now, older looking than he had been a year ago, in the way that great events sometimes age people more than time does. The Dravathi commander stood on her other side in full ceremony armor. The inscription on the base of the monument had been argued over in the conclave for 3 months. Every species had wanted to contribute a line. The Dravathi had wanted an epic poem. The Cath had wanted a formal historic dedication. Eventually Muria had proposed something simpler, and after some discussion, it had been accepted. It was written in every language spoken in the galaxy, hundreds of scripts carved into the dark stone and careful, even lines covering the entire base of the monument. It read, "They were silent for 30,000 years, not because they were gone, but because they were still fighting for us." Muria stood and looked at it for a long time. Somewhere, she thought, in the dark that was just ordinary dark now, no breach, no unraveling, no wound in the fabric of things. The crew of the Prometheus had found whatever was on the other side of the passage they had closed. She did not know what that was. She did not know if it was kind. She hoped it was quiet. She hoped it was warm. She thought it was probably what Ara would have called a fair trade.